My dad wants me to lend him money, after he secretly gave my college fund to my stepbrother. The first time I felt like a stranger in my father's house, I was 10 years old. I am his daughter, but sometimes I wonder if he ever really saw me that way. It wasn't a sudden realization, more like a creeping awareness that settled into my bones over time. My parents had been divorced for 2 years by then, and although I lived with my mom during the week, I spent weekends at my dad's new home. It was a nice house, bigger than the small apartment where my mom and I lived. It had a backyard with a white wooden fence and a porch swing that swayed gently in the breeze. It should have felt welcoming, but it didn't. From the moment I stepped inside, I understood something unspoken. This was their home, and I was just visiting. Dad had remarried less than a year after the divorce, and with that came Linda and her son, Josh. Josh was a year younger than me, with sandy brown hair and an easy, charming way about him that made adults fawn over him. He called my dad Steve at first, but by the end of that first year, he had started calling him Dad. That should have been my first warning. Linda wasn't unkind, but she wasn't particularly warm either. She treated me like a guest she had to tolerate because I came with the man she had married. Everything in the house reflected them. The family portraits on the wall showed Dad, Linda, and Josh smiling in coordinated outfits. The Christmas stockings that hung by the fireplace every December had only 3 names stitched onto them. I never had my own room in that house. My dad told me it was because I was only there on weekends that it didn't make sense to dedicate a whole room to me when Josh was there full-time. Instead, I got a pull-out couch in the small office space. By the time I was 16, I had learned not to expect much from my dad. But there was one thing I had always believed in, the college fund. He had mentioned it in passing over the years, always in the same reassuring tone. "Don't stress about money," he'd say when I talked about school. "I've been saving up for you since you were little." I held on to those words. College was my escape plan. I studied hard, knowing that if I could just get into a good school, I could finally have something that was mine. I started working part-time at a local diner, saving what I could for small expenses. But the bigger cost, tuition, housing, books, was supposed to be covered. Dad had said so, and despite everything, I believed him. I had to. It wasn't until my senior year of high school that the first crack appeared. It was a chilly autumn evening when I first tried to bring it up seriously. Dad was sitting in his recliner, his attention half on the football game playing on the TV. I stood near the doorway, clutching a college brochure in my hands. I was thinking about visiting some campuses soon. Maybe we could go over the college fun stuff together. For the first time, he hesitated. It was only for a second, but I caught it, the slight shift in his posture, the way his fingers tightened around the armrest. Then he smiled, the same easy, dismissive smile he always gave when he wanted to wave something away. "Nothing to worry about," he said. "I've got it handled." I should have pressed him then, but I didn't, because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative, that he had lied, that the future I had envisioned wasn't real, was too terrifying to face. So I swallowed my doubts and let myself believe. For a little while longer. Winter came, and with it, my first college acceptance letter. I still remember the exact moment I opened it. The envelope was thick, the school's crest embossed on the front. My fingers trembled as I tore it open. For the first time in my life, it felt like the world was opening up for me. That night, I sat across from my dad and Linda at the dinner table, my heart pounding. I got into my first choice school. I announced, trying to keep my voice steady. Dad smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Linda didn't look surprised. "That's great," she said, cutting into her chicken. "It's a good school." It was a simple response, but something about it felt off. Like she already knew what was coming next. I turned to Dad. "So, I was thinking we could go over the college fund soon, just to figure out what's covered and what isn't." The room went quiet. Linda put down her fork, dabbing at her mouth with a napkin. Dad cleared his throat. And that's when I knew. I didn't know the details yet, but I knew something was wrong. I just didn't realize how bad it was. The silence at the dinner table stretched too long. My father, who usually had no trouble filling the room with empty words, was suddenly quiet. Linda shifted in her chair, eyes flicking toward him, waiting. It was subtle, but I caught it. The slight tension in her shoulders, the way she set her utensils down carefully, deliberately. She knew something I didn't. And then my father sighed. Not a normal sigh. A deep, tired, guilty sigh. "Look," he started, rubbing his temples. "Things didn't exactly work out the way I planned." He exhaled through his nose. as if he was the one with a burden to carry. The fun, things changed. I had to make some choices. I was gripping my chair now. What choices? Linda pressed her lips together. My father avoided my eyes. And then, finally, the words came. I used it for Josh. The room seemed to tilt. The sounds of dinner, the clinking silverware, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant murmur of the TV, faded into a dull, muted buzz. He sighed again, as if this was exhausting for him. Josh needed help. He was struggling, and you gave my college fund to him? My voice came out hoarse. Linda finally spoke. It was the best decision for the family. The family. That phrase hit harder than I expected. I thought about the Christmas stockings, the family portraits, the house that never had a space for me. I thought about all the times I had been told I was part of the family while being treated like an outsider. This was just the final confirmation. You always said you had money saved for me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I did, Dad admitted, his fingers tightening around his glass of water. But things changed. You know how hard it's been. And Josh, he needed it more. He needed it more. Now you both needed it. Now we'll find a way to help you too. Just Josh needed it more. And what about me? I asked, my voice sharp, brittle. What am I supposed to do? Dad leaned forward like he was trying to be reasonable. You're smart. You can get scholarships, take out loans. And Josh couldn't? I snapped. Linda inhaled sharply, as if I had said something inappropriate. Josh's situation was different. I almost laughed. Different? In what way? Because he was their son? Because he was in their house every day, while I was just a leftover obligation from a past life. I stared at my father, the man who had promised me, over and over, that my future was safe, that I didn't have to worry, that he had my back. All lies. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. You should have told me, I said, my voice low, shaking. You should have told me years ago, instead of letting me think I had something to rely on. I didn't want to disappoint you. I pushed back my chair. My appetite had vanished. Dad sighed again, like this was some great inconvenience for him. I know this is hard to hear, but we can figure something out. He had already figured something out for Josh, not for me. I grabbed my bag and stormed out. I didn't care that it was late, or that I didn't have a ride yet. I needed to leave before I said something I couldn't take back. Linda didn't stop me. Dad didn't stop me. They let me walk out that door without a second thought. And that told me everything I needed to know. I don't remember the walk back to my mom's apartment that night. Only the sharp bite of cold air against my skin and the distant hum of passing cars. My mind was too full, too loud. My father's voice, his words, kept replaying over and over. Josh needed it more. You're smart. You'll figure something out. I had spent my entire life believing that my father would always have my back. That even if he wasn't always the most present, even if I never truly felt like I belonged in his new family, he would at least keep his promise to me. I was wrong. By the time I reached my mom's building, my hands were numb from the cold. I climbed the stairs to our apartment, feeling heavier with every step. The second I walked inside, she knew something was wrong. My mom had always been good at that. Even when I tried to keep things from her, she could read me too easily. She was standing in the kitchen, her curly hair pulled into a messy bun, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. She didn't ask right away. Instead, she set the tea down and leaned against the counter, waiting. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the floor. Then, finally, I broke. Dad used my college fund for Josh. The words felt like glass shards in my throat. Saying them out loud made them real. Mom didn't react right away. She didn't gasp, didn't immediately launch into anger. Instead, she inhaled slowly, deliberately. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. Too calm. He what? I told her everything. The dinner, the way he hesitated before telling me, the way Linda had just sat there like it was already decided, like I had no right to be upset. By the time I was done, Mom's hands were clenched into fists. Her expression was tight, controlled. But her eyes, the storm behind them, told me everything. I'm so sorry, baby, she said, reaching for me. And for the first time that night, I let myself collapse into her arms. I wasn't the type to cry easily, but in that moment, I couldn't hold it back. I had worked so hard. I had trusted him, and he had thrown me aside like I didn't matter. Mom held me for a long time, rubbing slow, comforting circles against my back. When I finally pulled away, she exhaled, her jaw tight. "You don't have to see him again," she said quietly. "Not if you don't want to." I swallowed hard. I don't know what I want, because part of me still wanted to believe there was a way to fix this. That maybe, somehow, he would realize what he had done and try to make it right. The next few weeks were a blur of stress and scrambling. I had to completely rethink my college plans. Loans were my only real option now, and even with them, I still had to figure out how to pay for living expenses. I picked up extra shifts at the diner. I spent late nights filling out every scholarship application I could find. It was exhausting. And my father? He didn't reach out. Not at first. I half expected him to show up, to call, to at least try to explain himself. But the days passed, and nothing. It wasn't until a month later that I finally heard from him. A short text. "Hey, just checking in. Hope you're doing okay." Like nothing had happened. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. A million things I wanted to say, all jumbled together. In the end, I just locked my phone and shoved it into my pocket. I had nothing to say to him. Graduation came and went. I walked across the stage, collected my diploma, and smiled for the cameras. My mom was there, cheering the loudest. My dad wasn't. I left for college that fall, carrying the weight of student loans and the bitter ache of betrayal. But I refused to let it break me. I worked, I studied, I pushed forward, and slowly, I built a life without him. Years passed. The pain dulled into something quieter, something that still lingered but no longer consumed me. I had made peace with the fact that my father had chosen someone else over me, or at least I thought I had, until the day he came back, asking me for help. It had been years since I had last seen my father. At first, after I left for college, there were a few half-hearted attempts at contact. A text here, a short email there. He always phrased them the same way, like we had just drifted apart naturally, like he wasn't the one who had let me down. I never blocked his number, but I never made an effort to reach out either. And after a while, the messages stopped coming. I had assumed he had moved on, that he was too busy with his real family to care about the daughter he had let slip through the cracks. Until one evening, out of nowhere, his name appeared on my phone screen. I almost didn't recognize it at first. Dad. The word felt foreign now, like it belonged to someone I had left behind. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the decline button. But something, curiosity maybe, made me answer. I barely had time to say hello before he spoke. "Hey," he said, his voice strained. "It's been a while." "A while?" "Try years." I didn't bother hiding the cold edge in my voice. "What do you want?" A pause. Then a heavy sigh. "Well," he said, his tone shifting into something almost sheepish. "I was hoping we could talk. Maybe grab coffee? Catch up? After everything?" "I'm busy," I said flatly. I thought that would be the end of it. But then he said something that made me pause. "Please," he said, his voice suddenly heavier, more desperate. I wouldn't ask if I didn't need to. And just like that, I knew. This wasn't about reconnecting. This wasn't some grand realization on his part that he had wronged me and wanted to make amends. No, he wanted something. I should have hung up right then and there. But against my better judgment, I found myself saying, "Fine. One coffee." That's it. The cafe was small, tucked into a quiet corner of the city. I picked it because it was close to my office, easy to escape from if this conversation went the way I suspected it would. When I walked in, I spotted him immediately, and I almost didn't recognize him. The man sitting at the table was not the confident, put-together father I remembered. He looked older, not just in the way time naturally ages people, but in the way life wears on someone. His hair had thinned, his shoulders slumped slightly. There was a tiredness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. For a moment, a flicker of something almost like pity sparked in me. But then I remembered why I was here. I sat down across from him, keeping my posture stiff, defensive. He smiled, but it was thin, nervous. "It's good to see you." I didn't return the sentiment. Instead, I went straight to the point. "Why am I here, Dad?" He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Look, I know I messed up. I should have done better by you." I didn't say anything. He cleared his throat. "Things have been rough lately." There it was. I sat back in my chair, crossing my arms. "Define rough." He exhaled slowly. "Linda and I split up. That surprised me. For so long, they had been this united front, their perfect little family, while I had been pushed to the sidelines. What happened? I asked, not because I particularly cared, but because I wanted to hear him say it. He shrugged. Money problems. She took off, and well, things fell apart. I stared at him, unblinking. Money problems? A bitter smile flickered across his lips. Yeah, turns out, I should have been a little more careful with it. I almost laughed. The irony was too much. So let me guess, I said, tilting my head. You need money. His expression twisted, shame flickering across his face. I was hoping, he hesitated. Just a loan? Just until I can get back on my feet. I stared at him. This man who had looked me in the eye years ago and told me Josh needed it more. This man who had left me to drown in student debt while he handed over my future to someone else. And now he wanted me to save him? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. Do you remember what you said to me that night? He blinked, caught off guard. What? The night you told me you gave my college fund away. I said, my voice calm but firm. You told me I'd figure it out because I was smart. His mouth opened, then shut. I smiled, but it wasn't warm. So, Dad, you're smart. Figure it out. The color drained from his face. I grabbed my bag and stood, and then I walked out of that cafe, leaving him behind, just like he had left me. I had spent years carrying the weight of my father's betrayal. Years wondering if I had been overreacting, if maybe I had been too bitter, too unwilling to forgive. But sitting across from him, listening to his carefully chosen words, seeing the same selfish patterns play out all over again, it confirmed everything I had already known. He wasn't sorry. Not really. He just needed something from me now, just like Josh had needed something from him back then. And I wasn't going to be his second choice again. But even as I walked down the street, my heart hammering in my chest, I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, exhaustion, and beneath it all, a dull ache that I couldn't quite shake. No matter how much I told myself that I didn't care anymore, there was still a small, fractured part of me that had once been a daughter who just wanted her father to choose her. And he never had. I didn't hear from him after that. Not for weeks. Not for months. And honestly, I hadn't expected to. My life moved on. I had a stable job, a small apartment that I had worked hard to afford, and a future that I had built on my own. But every so often, I would catch myself thinking about that meeting. The way he had looked at me, expecting something I could never give him. I tried to push it away, try not to care. But then, almost a year later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. At first, I ignored it. But when the same number called again the next day, a nagging feeling in my gut made me pick up. Hello? There was silence on the other end, and then a familiar voice. It was Josh. I almost hung up right then and there. Why are you calling me? A pause. Then, it's about Dad. I stiffened. I don't care, I said automatically. I know, he said. But you should hear this anyway. I met Josh at a coffee shop. Not the same one where I had last seen my father, but a different one across town. It was strange seeing him after so many years. He looked older, but not in the way Dad had. He looked worn out, like life had chewed him up and spit him back out. I didn't bother with small talk. What do you want? I asked as I sat down. Josh exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Dad's not doing great. I raised an eyebrow. I gathered that much when he came begging me for money. Josh flinched but nodded. Yeah, well, it's worse now. He lost the house. I blinked. What? He sighed. He got behind on payments. I guess he thought he'd have more time to fix things, but Linda leaving really screwed him over. He had to sell a bunch of stuff just to keep afloat, and eventually it wasn't enough. For a moment, I just stared at him. That house. The house where I had never truly belonged, where I had always been a guest. Gone. He's staying in some crappy rental now, Josh continued, barely making ends meet. I folded my arms. And why are you telling me this? Josh hesitated. Because he won't say it, but I think he regrets what he did to you. I let out a short, humorless laugh. No, he doesn't. Josh frowned. If he regretted it, I cut in. He would have reached out to apologize, not to ask for a handout. He would have tried to make things right when he still had something to offer me, not when he had nothing left. Josh looked away, rubbing his jaw. Maybe you're right. I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. Josh, why are you here? What do you want from me? He hesitated again. Then finally he said it. I just thought, maybe you want to talk to him. I stared at him for a long moment, then shook my head. No. I mean it, I said, my voice firm. I spent too many years wishing he'd see me as his daughter. I spent too many years waiting for him to care. But he never did. And I'm done. Josh swallowed, looking like he wanted to argue. But in the end, he just nodded. And that was the last time I ever spoke to him. I never saw my father again. Not when he moved into a smaller apartment. Not when he started working odd jobs to stay afloat. Not even when, years later, I heard from someone else that he had passed away. I didn't go to the funeral, and I didn't feel guilty about it. Some people might say that family is family, that no matter what, I should have found a way to forgive him, that I was cruel. But I disagree. Family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up for you. And my father never had. So I moved on. I built a life without him,